Okay, welcome officially to the first webinar of our 4-webinar series on cyber defense strategies with IT Masters and Charles Sturt University. My name is Jack. I am your MC, facilitator type person for today. And we are joined by Lily, who is going to be doing some admin assistance on the back end, making sure that everything runs smoothly, as well as George Thomas, who I will introduce properly in a moment, who is our mentor for this short course. For the very beginning, as usual, I'd just like to acknowledge that we're coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and pay our respects to their elders and ancestors, and honour the ongoing connection of Indigenous peoples, both in Australia and around the world, to lands, waters, and culture. And so to begin tonight, cyber defense strategies, thank you everybody for joining in. A little bit of housekeeping before we get officially started. Down the bottom of your Zoom screen, which I'm sure everybody is very familiar with at this point, you should see both a Q&A section and a chat section. If you've got a specific question for our mentor, George, on the topics that we're covering in the webinar, you can direct those to the Q&A section, and we will get to those if we can, time pending, etc., in the Q&A sections that we've designated throughout the webinar. If you've got anything to share with the other participants, as well as the panelists, comments and insights and such, feel free to direct those to the webinar chat, where you can talk amongst yourselves and as well with us throughout the webinar. As always, the content for today's webinar will be recorded and it will be uploaded to Learn, LEARN, at itmasters.edu.au, where you can also access forums for discussion with mentors and other students, as well as all of the course materials, readings, links, etc., that are relevant to this webinar. So they will be uploaded within 24 hours to learn.itmasters.edu.au. I'd like to welcome to this short course our mentor, the wonderful George Thomas, who is a subject mentor at Charles Sturt University and IT Masters since 2019, teaching cyber warfare and terrorism and server admin subjects with us. And the official introduction, Dr. George Thomas, many acronyms following his name, has a Doctor of Information Technology, a Master of Management in Information Technology, and a Bachelor of Information Technology in sysadmin from Charles Sturt University, as well as a graduate certificate from Deakin in higher education. He's a member of the Ethics Committee on the Australian Computer Society Professional Advisory Board and a 3-time Microsoft MVP Award recipient. So it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. George Thomas. Take it away, George.
Thanks, Jack. Appreciate the introduction. Hoping everyone can hear me. I see a little thing going up and down. So welcome, everybody. Yeah, pretty excited to get started. So I'm always one to just kind of get going. And look, cyber defense strategies, I think it's been really useful to see the various levels of experience within the chat. So you know, the sort of variation between some folks that are new to the industry and some that are you know, moderate, and some that have got, you know, a bit more experience. And so hopefully everyone can get a little bit out of these next 4 weeks. It's 4 weeks, right? And so a little bit, I guess, about me, and I guess this short course is I've been in this industry now professionally for about 23 years. Pretty easy to remember when I started in 2000. I think initially more IT security or IT focused, with a sort of security background, and then for the last sort of 14 years moving into a pure security role, and a lot of those, senior management roles. And I think what I'm getting at is a lot of what we're going to go through has been kind of the learnings along the way from, sort of best practices and implementing, cyber programs and cyber defense strategies, in Australia and overseas. So as I said, hopefully hopefully there's something you can take away. In terms of a bit of a structure of the next 4 weeks, and you've probably seen some of this on the IT Masters website, but module 1, we're going to talk about introduction and identifying cyber risk. Module 2 and module 3, or weeks 2 and 3, as you can probably see, it's a bit repetitive because there's going to be a lot to get through, but we're going to look at administrative and technical controls, and I'll get into a bit more detail into what some of these are for anyone that's not familiar with the terminology. And then finally, in the final week, we'll look at some more of the implementation strategies and some of the pain points and lessons learned along the way, because trust me, I've had quite a few of those hiccups and bumps to deal with over the past few years. Also about being able to get budget and building business cases and things like that, and funding, and then being able to demonstrate return on investment and effectiveness of a cyber defense strategy. So yeah, and then at the end there's an assessment. So, and I believe there's a certificate at the end. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm waiting for Jack. Pretty sure there is. After you successfully.
You are not wrong.
Yeah, but you got to pass the exam. And then I think at the end of each week, there is a short sort of quiz that you need to sort of progress through. Let's see if I got that right. So let's start with week 1. I know time is precious, and I know everyone's taking time out of their day to come and learn and watch me talk about stuff. So let's go with week 1. So current threat landscape. I always like to start with a bit of background on the current cyber threat landscape. Now, this is just to kind of almost set the scene. Also a very useful thing when you're trying to get a point across, if you're building a business case or trying to understand where or what your cyber program needs to address. So having a bit of background as to what the sort of cyber landscape is currently, because it is always evolving, it is always changing. It's good to take that. And even from just this, you'll see some of the key resources that are often used to, pull data and insights into the current cyber threat landscape. And we'll step through that. The next part is around taking a risk-based approach to cyber defense. So this is where you start to identify the risks to your organization, and start to assess those, which you then will help determine where to focus effort and what sort of controls need to be implemented and things like that. And then the final part today is about building a cyber defense strategy. And so this is that kind of high level overarching strategy, and we'll start talking about that. And we're then going to, I guess, in the coming weeks, start to build on that to some of the more technical controls, and how to, effectively address kind of what's taken from, the threat landscape and the risk-based stuff to then, put in controls that are effective, measure them, those sorts of things. So hopefully that all makes sense. So to start with, current cyber threat landscape. Now, I do understand, looking at the chat, that there are quite a few folks that are connecting in from overseas. And the reason I say that is because the next slide is some figures from the OAIC, which is the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner. So our privacy officer, or privacy commissioner from government. Having said that, there is similar information available from other jurisdictions, and obviously, if you're in the EU, the GDPR authority will have some data on that. But this is the Australian one. So having said that, I think it doesn't really differ too much in terms of a general theme that we can sort of talk about. And that theme is that every year data breaches are rising. So every year they rise. We could see here over just even a few months, there's been an increase. I guess the threat actors had some holidays over November, but we could see this is the last half of last year that there's been this increase in data breaches and even the notifications. So anyone that's not familiar, in Australia, like in many other jurisdictions, there's a notification requirement where personal information has been breached, and you have to notify the commissioner, and they compile this report. And so there's been a 26% increase in the last report. So is it July to December 2022? About on data breaches. So as I said, these are the ones that are more specific to privacy breaches, and we will talk about data management as well. But obviously very important topic. And then with things like privacy reforms in Australia, obviously, but privacy reforms that are happening here, we've seen a lot of high profile breaches over the past sort of 12 months. I won't name names, but I'm sure you've probably been across some of those or been involved in terms of had your information affected. I think we can't sort of underemphasize the importance of this. So the next thing is who are these threat actors? What are they doing? And so it's your typical kind of run the mill here, organized crime. So a lot of organized crime groups have switched from the traditional let's just sort of smash and grab and steal stuff to using cyber, given that it's borderless, it's easier to be more anonymous. Obviously state-sponsored actors, so nation states who have those capabilities, they're being able to commit cyber attacks that for example for espionage or secret stealing or even destruction, depending on who the state sponsor actor is and their motives. You've got your hacktivists that are hacking for a cause. Obviously terrorists, individual hackers, so they're sort of folks that are at home, typically for personal or financial gain. We see this a lot. There's a lot of this going on with things like, and many of you are probably aware, phishing attacks. That's a big one. So tricking someone into divulging their credentials, getting access to their their mailbox, and then doing things like making fake invoices or getting personal information or all sorts of things. We're also seeing things like malicious and accidental insiders. So those are the insider threats. So people that are accidentally sent stuff, whoops, didn't mean to do it. There was no malicious intent. They just sort of messed up. And then malicious, where someone is maliciously sending information out, whether they're stealing it or whatnot. And one thing that's kind of scary, I was at one of the security conferences a couple of months back. There's now this concept of insiders that are being paid by organized crime groups, for example, to ransomware organizations, like ransomware their own organizations for a cut of the profits. So there's stuff like that happening as well. And then what we're seeing is 82%, and I believe this was the Verizon report, I think it's down the bottom, 82% of breaches involved a human element. So so that's pretty alarming. We're seeing an increase in ransomware. There was a bit of a sort of spike in misconfiguration, and which has kind of settled a bit, but still a little bit higher. But that's kind of what we're seeing. Almost done on the threat landscape stuff. Finally, the other piece is around dwell time. And so once again, I apologize. This is the APAC data, but you can get this data from Mandiant. So dwell time is the amount of time it takes from when a threat actor is in the environment or gains access to the environment to when they are detected. And so basically, they'll sit there quietly or, doing whatever it is that they do. And then when someone alerts the sort of victim to the fact that there's a threat actor in there, that is considered that dwell time. And just to kind of explain this chart a little bit, so because it's a little bit confusing how all is like lower then external and internal. So external is when the source of the notification is from an external source. For example, someone from the public or the outside says, "Hey, by the way, did you know you've been hacked?" And then internal is the internal the internal number of notifications. So those internal external numbers are basically from where the actual origination of that notification was versus all, which is a number that we're more concerned about. So it's the gray one. So for example, the global average dwell time in 2021 is in 2022 is 16 days, but in Australia we're sitting at 33. So we are above the global time. So yeah, so that's always fun. So this was kind of it on the because there's quite a lot to get through tonight. So this is the kind of landscape stuff. So I guess the key thing here is threat actors in there for a bit of time before they're becoming detected. Obviously, there's quite a lot of data breaches going on. There's a lot of sort of different threat actor groups, and we're seeing increases in things like ransomware. Misconfiguration seems to have settled down a little bit, but we're also seeing a lot of phishing-based attacks and email-based attacks. In fact, there are some threat actors that are now really kind of focusing on the use of phishing because it is quite a successful way to gain access to an environment. And so when we start talking about how we're going to look at risk and how we're going to sort of build this out, factors like that are taken into account. What is the the most exploitable and what are the kind of interesting to threat actor attack surfaces that we need to consider. So do we want to I'll pause here for a moment and then we'll continue. So
would you like me to deliver you some questions?
Yeah, that's a good idea. Let's see if I can answer them. Sometimes there's always one that I'm like, ooh, I don't know.
Interesting. Well, I wonder what we are going to find with that. Just another little housekeeping note on that. Once again, if participants have questions for George that's on the topics that are being covered in the webinar, please direct those to the Q&A section rather than the chat section, because we are not able to keep up with the number of messages that come through the chat. So the questions that were asked in the Q&A are going to be considered to be asked to George, and questions in the chat are just insights that you can share with your fellow participants and the panelists as well. So, a really interesting question from Sarah asks, what changed from 2017 to 2018 to bring those numbers down?
Oh, okay. Yeah, so this was interesting. I mean, I don't know the exact answer, but I have some wild theories. Now, interesting about this report, this is kind of the new Mandiant where we're at. This is the Mandiant M-Trends report. When prior to this, so prior to 2017, and you can kind of see 2016 looks a bit funny. Prior to this, the global and it was a global report, so it wasn't split into regions. This is sort of a bit of a backstory here. It wasn't split into regions, and there was a kind of, I don't know if anyone knows the exact number, but it was around sort of 570 days was the dwell time. And I think that in Australia, the maturity of this region wasn't as good as it is now. And the reason I talk about this report being split is, when I had conversations with Mandiant back then, they said, oh, by the way, this report is getting split into APJ, so Asia Pacific Japan, and the rest of the world, because apparently our data was skewing the results, because at this time we as in Australia or Asia Pac and Japan didn't have the same level of detection capabilities as a lot of the rest of the world. And I kind of wonder if a lot of that was influenced by things like GDPR and a lot of the tightening regulations that tend to happen there before here and this region. And so I think what's happened is this really highlighted when that report was split that there was a big issue in this region. And then subsequently, we're starting to see those significant drops. I also think it's kind of a little bit misleading is not the right word, but maybe it is a little bit misleading because when you think about this is kind of the first time this report ran for this sort of region, and it is possible that one I guess victim organization that's part of this result, or maybe a few, had really long dwell times because they didn't have those capabilities. They put that in there, then they discovered that that threat actor had been in there for potentially years. So yeah, it was pretty interesting to see that, and I think it was a little bit of a wake up call. But yeah, as I said, once this sort of happened, you could see there's a steady drop, and I think my experience having come out of the US, so I was in the US till funnily enough, the start of 2017, and my first thought was, oh, there's a bit of work to be done here. And then I think progressively over the last 6 years, we are definitely making strides in this region to, bolster our capabilities and things like that. So I think this is more of a demonstration of a few things, one around data and one around maturity. That was a very long answer, sorry.
I thought it was a very good answer. Thank you very much. And just on that, actually, we've had a few requests from people to just clarify the concept of dwell time. So I think you answered the questions very well that were asked about the difference between dwell time in Australia and the rest of the world. Thank you for that. But we've got some questions around dwell time and bounce rate, the same thing, and just requesting if does the all dwell time show the average of external and internal figures? And what are the differences in terms of tooling and things like that? If you'd like to just give us a really brief clarification on the concept of dwell time.
So there's a few different things. So dwell time, to be fair, is the term that Mandiant used. There are different terms that are used. I'm not familiar with the bounce one. But in short, what it is the time from when a threat actor gains access to an environment to the time that they are detected. So, if you think about an advanced persistent threat, and we, in my subject, we talk a lot about APTs and those sort of threat actors. But if you can imagine an APT gets access to an environment, and let's say, hypothetically, this is very well time, let's say they get access January 1. And then they're not detected until December 31, then the dwell time will be 365 days. So that's what that means. The whole all thing, this was really hard for me to get my head around the first time. I'm like, how is all those numbers added up? That doesn't seem right. And I think it's a little bit tricky because what that is that there's sort of three different metrics. All is actually the dwell time. But the two other figures, external and internal, talk about the days for notification. So they're almost independent. So they're not an average or they're not added together. Because yeah, if you sit there, people probably did the math because I tried that. I'm like, how on earth is 1088 plus 320.5 divided by 249? It's not. It's a different piece of data. They just kind of wanted to represent that, hey, 1,088 notifications happened from external sources, 320.5, and some of those will also potentially be for the same event, for the same threat actor. So, multiple people may have reported it that were external or internal. So it's a little bit of a tricky one. So yeah, but yes, it is very hard to kind of get your head around. I literally had to sit there and scratch my head looking at it, and then had to read the whole report and go, oh, now I kind of get it.
All right, thank you very much. Now we've got a very large number of questions as well. Let's have a look at what some of those are. Just checking. Will you be covering later on in the course as well? Please let me know if any of these questions that I'm asking are going to be covered later on. But Joe has asked a recent not-for-profit IT webinar warned about how AI will significantly increase cyber threats across the board, particularly relating to phishing and zero-day exploits. Wondering about your thoughts on this, or perhaps this will be covered later.
Look, I think that's a fantastic question, obviously very timely and topical. I have been in many meetings to discuss this very thing. I think, the short answer is that yes, this is a very real risk, and don't get me wrong, there are quote safeguards in place to help mitigate some of this stuff, but we've all seen probably the whole, maybe if you ask it a different way, as in something like an AI platform, it'll answer the question anyway. But I think it's probably one that does. I'm going to answer it because I think it's relevant to the next section, which is around risk and identifying risk. And I think perhaps maybe it's going to be more useful when we talk about administrative controls, at least now, and maybe some technical controls as well as to how to sort of address it. But I think my thoughts are that, and we've seen the power of some of this new AI stuff, that there's no, I think it's a very real risk that someone could use AI to craft like a perfect phishing campaign, something free of errors, and to make it look like exactly something else. And we've seen also examples where where AI has been used to write exploits. So I think the answer is, yeah, I feel like that this is something that needs to be, obviously taken as part of risk management, which we'll talk about, and addressed. But I think it's still very immature from a almost, and I'm right now, my role is in a governance role. I'm head of data and cyber governance, and I'm trying to wrap my head around how we deal with that. So yeah, interesting question, but definitely one that I think we need to watch this space, and we need to consider as cyber professionals and emerging and current and future, just to basically understand those risks.
Great, thank you. And just one more perhaps until we move on for the next section. We've got a few people asking about who is obligated to report these types of breaches, and what kind of government agencies are monitoring the environment for threats and alerting the public, and do they exist in Australia?
Yeah, so in terms of reporting obligations, and we will talk about obligations in a few slides, but the example here was the notifiable data breach scheme that came in 2018 in Australia. And so I just see some pop in the chat there, but yeah, so the OAIC did some amendments to the Privacy Act where the NDB scheme was implemented, whereby if you're and I'm going to say we're an organization that is covered by this, and the reason I say that is because it's not every organization. There are certain organizations that aren't covered. For example, there's small business exemptions, and there's also government exemptions and things like that. But where you're an organization that is covered by the Privacy Act, and you have a data breach that results in what they call serious harm, bit of a subjective test, but serious harm to an individual, then you have to notify the OAIC, so the Privacy Commissioner, and you have to notify the affected individuals. So that is one area. I think there's been some talk about, and I can't remember where they kind of landed with that, around if you're a victim of ransomware, that you can report that to the ACSC, so the Australian Cybersecurity Centre. The other thing is there are some mandatory requirements for certain industries like critical infrastructure. And so that would have been, I think, as part of the SOCI, or the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act. So there's lots of varying requirements. Privacy is one of them, which focuses on privacy and personal information. Whereas, one that focuses on critical infrastructure providers might be SOCI. So, and then APRA will have regulation. So that's the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority, which sort of regulates banks and insurance. So there's very different requirements. Yeah, so it depends. What was there a second part of that question? I can't remember now.
No, I think you did a great job in answering that. Thank you.
All right, I should keep going. So the next thing, my favorite, taking a risk-based approach to cyber defense. I think we often hear about taking a risk-based approach. I mean, I certainly feel like I've heard it so many times now that it's, I don't know, it's just getting old. But at the end of the day, it is a very, very good way and very effective way to build out a cyber defense strategy, because just like any other type of risk, cyber risk, needs to be identified, it needs to be assessed. It helps, you need to prioritize, and then, you need to apply treatment. And you also need to make sure that the cost of treating that risk doesn't exceed the potential cost of impact. So in other words, there's like a cost benefit analysis, right? So for example, if you identify that there's a risk and it's going to cost $1 million to fix it because you have to like buy the most fancy thing on the planet to install the new shiny, one of my old colleagues used to say, but the actual impact of that risk is probably say 100 grand, then obviously that would be a bad decision and you wouldn't do it, which is why it's important. So, I think, and apology if there's vendors out there on this call, but, there are a lot of products out there and it can be very confusing. And there's a lot of like innovation, and think about it, there's a lot of innovations, there's a lot of very good products that do a really great job. But at the end of the day, and especially when we talk about, business cases and budgets and getting funding, you're going to struggle if you can't provide some meaningful basis for why you want to get, that $1 million, especially if you say, well, what is the actual impact? And the actual impact is far less than that cost. So that would be a poor risk decision. So let's talk about that. But first, let's talk about what risk is, because I think this is interesting. So ISO, if anyone that's LinkedIn stalked me at any point, you'll probably see that I've got a lot of ISO stuff. So ISO 27001 is kind of, I've done a lot of work in that space. So certified lead implementer, lead auditor. And so I always pluck out the ISO stuff. So there's going to be a couple ISO related bits in here. But the effect of uncertainty on objectives, pretty vague. So there's some slightly more detailed definitions. I think it's Stanford says the possibility that the occurrence of an event will adversely affect the achievement of the organization's objectives. But then, I kind of like the Cambridge Dictionary one, the possibility of something bad happening. Yeah, okay. That's pretty straightforward, isn't it? Something bad. How likely is that going to happen? Having said that, there is positive risk too. So just for anyone that's thinking, but risks should be positive. What those definitions before all sounded very negative, but there can be positivity. A positive risk has a positive impact on objectives, and that's sometimes also called opportunity risk. So sometimes we see that. And just to kind of round this out on the definition stuff, positive versus negative risk. Now we're going to focus on negative risk probably, but you should always consider the positive stuff too. So for example, a data breach occurs which results in reputational damage. I think we could probably all say that that's negative, and you'd be correct. However, outsourcing a critical service which results in improved uptime would be considered a positive risk. Outsourcing that critical service is a risk. You are taking a risk by doing that, but the outcome is positive, providing it all goes to plan, right? So that's kind of the differentiator between positive and negative risk. But like I said, we'll probably focus on, sorry, I saw one of the chat messages. We'll focus on the negative stuff. Sorry to be a downer, but yeah, we're going to go with that. So qualitative versus quantitative risk. This is really kind of important, and apologies for anyone that's familiar with this already. This is a bit kind of, sort of entry-level risk stuff, although it can be, maybe there's some useful things in here. So qualitative risk is subjective. It's about having someone that is a subject matter expert that will help determine whether a risk is high, medium, or low. It's not driven by actual metrics. It's kind of like, if this were to happen, it would be bad. That would be an example of a qualitative assessment. Quantitative, on the other hand, focuses on what can be quantified, so numbers. So there's some useful formulas down here. Ale, nothing to do with beer. So annual loss expectancy. So what that's basically saying is, and the formula is annual loss expectancy equals single loss expectancy times annual rate of occurrence. So to kind of flesh that out, if let's talk about a server. If you've got a server that, let's say, blows up, catches on fire, and it costs $100,000 to repair that or to replace it, then your single loss expectancy is $100,000. I mean, it's very, 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 very not deep analysis here, but and then let's say that happens twice a year. So your annual rate of occurrence is 2. So now you could say that your annual loss expectancy is $200,000 because $100,000 twice a year, $200,000. And so that is a quantifiable measure. And so what you can then say is, yes, thank you, Tori just spelled all that out in there. No, really, I probably should have done that. And so now what you could say is, okay, well, for us to do that, maybe we have to deal with that, maybe we have to put in a $20,000 fire suppression system. By the way, I'm sure they cost a lot more than that, but let's say the control to deal with that costs $20,000. Now you say, okay, well, it's going to cost $20,000 to help mitigate that risk. That prevents a loss of $200,000. Then that's a good decision, right? So that's kind of how that works. Single loss expectancy is this is a funny one because AV is asset value, and EV factor. It's a multiplier, but basically it's kind of like the sort of percentage that of that asset that will be sort of damaged. So, you know, say it's 0.5 or whatnot, but you could use that to calculate the single loss expectancy as well, and then feed that into the other formula. I guess one thing that I've seen a lot as well is the assignment of values. And so sometimes you can I guess assign values to qualitative assessments as well for the purpose of calculating what a risk will be. And sorry, I hope I'm not losing everybody, but for example, if you say likelihood, and likelihood is the likelihood that something is going to occur. So for example, is it unlikely? Is it possible? Is it likely? Is it almost certain? Those are ways to say, you know, how likely is something to occur. So for example, if you build something on a fault line, it is probably likely that you'll be affected by an earthquake. So that's a way to look at that. And you can assign numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then on the other scale, where it's got consequence, you might say, okay, so low, medium, high, extreme. And then you can assign a value to that. So let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, whatever. And then when you go, okay, it's a likelihood of 5 and the consequence is a 10, therefore the value is 50, then you've got a number and you can use that to determine whether it sits within inside a risk tolerance, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And if it is above that, then you need to consider putting controls in. If it is below that, then it's probably acceptable and you don't need to do anything about it. So, and we will talk about that, but you could use that to try and, you know, measure where risk sits. So before everyone falls asleep on me for talking about this, I'm going to skip forward. And so some key metrics to cover off here are appetite, tolerance, and threshold. So appetite is around describing a level that is acceptable, and that's very descriptive, as in our tolerance for data breaches is low. Once again, sounds a bit qualitative, subjective, but that would be an appetite. Whereas our tolerance for taking risks is high or whatever. So there's that, appetite is high. And then you've got the sort of tolerance. So what is the acceptable variations between, you know, what is a risk and you know, what is that sort of tolerance level? And then finally, the threshold. So if a risk were to exceed something and it can't be reduced, that is where a risk will not be accepted, and then you reject that risk. So that's that's kind of very, very fast risk, that like risk introduction type stuff. So talking about risk then feeds into things like risk frameworks. And so, you know, looking at risk frameworks, by the way, this is not an exhaustive list, it's just I've put examples up there, but ISO 31000 is a risk framework or risk standard. I'm going to dive into these a little bit deeper in a second. 27005, I feel like I saw that pop up somewhere. And then NIST 837, which is the NIST one. So I'm just going to skip forward. So 31,000, 2018. So this is risk management guidelines. This is released by ISO. It is very broad and it can be used and applied to risk across any organization. So it's a really good one if someone's building out an enterprise risk strategy. And I always feel that, you know, if there's an enterprise, I feel that risk should be at the enterprise level. And then even though you've got cyber risk, that should still be aligned with an enterprise risk strategy. You know, hopefully there is one. And it provides both framework and guidance on processing and managing risk. So that's 31,000. The next one is 27005. So 27005, 2022, which was released, I don't actually know. I know that the 27001 standard was released on October 25. So I'm going to say it was probably around the same time. It would have been last year, obviously, with the 2022. And so this is the risk management framework that complements the 27001 or the 27,000 family of standards from ISO. It follows the same structure as the other ISO standards, and it provides that guidance on managing risk, but in the context of information security. So it's more focused on information or cybersecurity versus 31,000, which is far more broad and can be applied to anything. And then finally, we have NIST 837 revision 2. And so this is the NIST risk management framework. It's used to manage security and privacy risk. One of the great things about this is it's free. So the ISO 31000 and 27005 risk standards, you have to buy them. I don't know how much they are. I feel like something like 180 Swiss francs rings a bell. Something like that, right? A couple of hundred Swiss francs. Whereas the NIST one is free. So that's a benefit. You can just download that from NIST. And so, yeah, and also that did just pop up. So NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's a US government department. They provide a lot of free resources. And so the risk management framework is one of them. They also do the cybersecurity framework, so the CSF, which is a free framework for building out a security program. And it talks about, identifying, detecting, responding and recovering to cyber threats. They also have NIST 853, which is very similar to our sort of information security manual. It's got that sort of, it's quite bulky too, which came out beforehand. But that was, funnily enough, the 853 was in response to some cyber incidents that happened at government level kind of in the early 2000s. So yeah, it's interesting too. And all those resources are available to freely download from nist.gov. So cool. Let's pause there for a second because I really need some water. And I think we're getting onto the cyber defense strategy stuff. So if we've got any questions.
We do. We have a great number of questions. Just so that everyone in the participants knows, there are a very large number of questions coming through, and we definitely don't have time to answer all of them tonight. But a great place to ask your questions and have those answered both by George and by other participants, and to have great discussions about that, is in the forum section at learn.itmasters.edu.au. So if you don't see your question answered today in the webinar, we do apologize. There's simply not enough time, but there is plenty of opportunity for discussion between yourselves and with George in the future on those forums. Again, just a reminder that the Q&A section is for direct questions to the subject mentor, to George, and comments and things can be directed to the chat section. I've got a couple of requests for some clarification or some extra detail. Rishi has asked, can you please briefly talk through the changes for the 2022 version of ISO 27001 or potentially 27005, this may be, compared to the former?
Yeah, let's go find that one. I did see that pop up somewhere. Please talk about the change to 22. So the 2022 standard was so the 27001/2022 came out last October. The key changes, and please don't quote me on this, but there was a reduction. Sorry, you can quote me on this, but there was a reduction in controls. Just can't remember the exact number. So there was a bit of simplification. I was going to say 92. God, I was close. So there was a simplification where the control numbers were consolidated. I think one of the criticisms with the 2013 edition, which came out beforehand, was there was a lot of overlap. And so in 2022, they reduced those controls. They also added some new items. So there was some controls explicitly around threat intelligence, logging, cloud, privacy. So that was really called out to, I think, align with the threat, the current cyber landscape and the threats that we're seeing. And it was interesting because when I think about building out a cyber defense strategy or a cyber program, those are things that I would expect to see. So it was kind of a bit weird not to have them in ISO for the last 10 years. And now they're there. So it's that's probably the key changes, is the addition of some new areas and then the consolidation of some older controls. To be fair though, most of that happened around the Annex A items. So ISO, and we will talk about this at some point, ISO is broken up into sort of two sections. You've got the standard, the 001 control, so clauses 4 to 10. They are really around almost the governance piece. So that's around your policies, your leadership, buy-in and support around things like, roles and responsibilities, around security objectives and continual improvement, internal audits in there as well. And then, and this is why this is important when we talk about risk, because ISO is really relevant because it's a risk-based approach to security. Use the annex controls. That's what's really changed. And those controls are used. And this is great when we talk about building this out, because you can use those controls to build out that strategy. So you could say, all right, well, here is a risk that I've identified. And I'll say we're going to kind of talk about this in a second. Here's a risk that I've identified. I'm going to use these controls from 27001 Annex A, which is basically the 27002 stuff, to treat those risks. And as I said, that's become more concise. And then some of the more contemporary controls have been called out. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. And a couple of other requests. So Matt has asked, risk appetite implies that the org gets some value from exposing themselves to that risk, but can you give an explicit example? And Jeanette has also asked, can you please provide an actual enterprise cyber risk example? And just a little note on time, in that we don't have a huge amount of it as well. Thank you.
Yeah, so risk appetite implies an org gets some value from exposing themselves. Yeah, so I think where this sort of sits is, I'm trying to think of an example where if you say that an organization has zero appetite for risk, I don't know if this is a good example, or like a good way to explain this, but if you say an organization has no appetite for risk, that means they need to do absolutely everything. And to be fair, you can't completely eliminate risk, so that's going to be pretty hard. But if an organization needs to provide some exposure to not end up basically trying to do everything, it does seem fluffy. That doesn't seem like an explicit example. But if you say, I don't know, I feel like I kind of want to come back to that for a bit of time to think of an example. Because when we talk about risk appetite statements, it's sort of really, and I've seen this, the organization has no tolerance for data loss, right? And I feel like to do that, you need to put in, well, I argue whether that's even achievable, but let's say hypothetically, to get as close to that as you want or as you can, you have to basically do everything. You've got to put in DLP, you've got to put in encryption, you've got to lock down ports, and suddenly you're going to end up with this point where things are no longer usable, or the cost is really going to skyrocket. So I think there needs to be that appetite discussion. How much risk are you willing, to sort of allow, and that will help drive what you do. So you might say, well, we can probably live with that, and that's within our appetite. So you would choose not to do it. So, but it is a good question, and I think it's probably one that's hard to provide an explicit example. It probably more something that would happen as part of a discussion about matching risk appetite statements to actually managing risk. So sorry if that didn't quite answer the question. In terms of an actual enterprise cyber risk example, look, I think phishing campaigns and business email compromise is probably enterprise-wide. I mean, I'll probably argue that everyone in an enterprise probably has access to email in many cases. And so there needs to be a few things here. One is that awareness across the entire organization and across the entire enterprise about that particular cyber risk. And I will talk about that in a little bit more detail in the next section. So I think from an enterprise level, that culture and awareness is across the board, because that can affect anybody in any department within an organization. So I'd probably consider that as a enterprise-wide cyber risk.
Great, thank you very much. I would say we should probably move on at this point. Again, if participants have questions that are not able to be answered tonight, you can direct those to the forums at learn.itmasters.edu.au. And you can also find all of the resources, including webinar uploads there within 24 hours of the webinar. Thank you.
Great. Now we're on the pointy end, I guess. So building a cyber defense strategy. So you've done the risk assessment. Well, we haven't, but let's say hypothetically we have. So we've done the risk assessment, and it's all in a risk register somewhere because you've got to keep track of it. And now it comes to the treatment of that risk. So I think the first thing is when you do a risk assessment, I probably should have said this before, is try to be as, it's tricky, but try to be as not granular as possible. So don't go down to the level of this Windows server here is vulnerable. Try and keep it a little bit more broad than that, because you need to treat that risk more broadly. That's usually probably the first thing that I'd say, because I've seen risk registers before that are literally just like basically security vulnerabilities. Now that's not really, that is a risk, but that could be rolled up into a security vulnerability risk. Yeah, you could split them out a little bit, but that's probably one of the key things. So the first thing I think is scope. So what is the scope of the cyber defense program? And I say that because, organizations can be complicated, and, maybe there are specific areas that need to be tackled first. Maybe there's specific departments, who knows? So think about scope. You can't do it all at once, typically. Now, what are the high value assets? And risk assessments will help with this, and on below, and what is likely to be exploited. So when you're going through that risk assessment, you're looking at things like, is it a high value asset? Is it internet facing? Does it hold personal information or other sensitive or confidential information? Are these the crown jewels? So what are the crown jewel systems? Those are the ones that probably, that's not to say the others are less important, because often threat actors will find a weak spot somewhere else. It could potentially laterally move. I know someone's probably going to start talking about things like zero trust, but we will talk about that in a later time. But what is likely to be exploited? And so that's probably the first thing, right? So it's about knowing your assets. One of the key things around pretty much every cyber sort of framework and standard is about knowing your assets. It's about inventory and knowing your assets. So ISO has an inventory of assets. The CIS critical controls have an inventory of assets and knowing your assets thing. NIST has that as well. That is the first piece. The next thing is to look at what are those key elements of that cyber defense strategy. So the first thing is a gap analysis will help. So, you're basically going through, you've identified your key assets, you're starting to put through, what those risks are, and you're starting to build out a treatment plan, but you need to know what you've got. And so there's a little bit of a chicken before the egg thing here about, what security controls do you have? What's the gap analysis? Where are the gaps? Do you need to select your controls? But, between these things, you should be able to identify your controls. You should be able to prioritize what are your key systems, and start going from there. As I said before, awareness and culture is also, really important. And then we've got data management. And by the way, there's more slides to go, so I should not start talking about these because then I'll have to skip through the slides. But data management, that's becoming more and more important, as you're probably already aware, or we will talk about in a minute. And then monitoring, measurement, and continual improvement. So these are a bit of a summary. We're going to dig into these in the following few weeks in a bit more depth. But the first thing is security controls. So we've got two types of really security controls that we'll be talking about. And that is technical and administrative controls. And so technical controls being, your firewalls and your DLP, data loss prevention, data leakage prevention, your antivirus, your application control / whitelisting, all that sort of stuff. And then your administrative controls are, by the way, that wasn't an exhaustive list. There's a lot more than that, but we'll get to that. And then your administrative controls are more of your policies and procedures and then things like that. And these are designed to mitigate and reduce identified risk. So, and as I said, if you start looking at things like ISO, you'll see, both administrative and technical controls kind of mentioned there. As I said, it can be very costly, especially on what you buy. So it's important to get the most appropriate controls and that they provide the greatest benefit, because, no one, maybe someone does. I certainly never have had an unlimited security budget. You don't just buy everything. Plus, I think I'd argue that it's going to start creating impact on user experience as well. And we will talk about things like that also. In terms of awareness and culture, as was mentioned earlier, and I think I've seen it pop up somewhere in the chat, 82% of data breaches involve the human element. There was that question about the human element. It does a human element. It doesn't necessarily that there's been direct contact with a threat actor. It could be something as simple as someone accidentally emailing something. That would be considered a human element. It means that there was a person involved in this breach, whether they disclosed their credentials, whether they got a phone call and did something they weren't supposed to, whether they bought somebody gift cards because they didn't have their credit card but they'll pay you back tomorrow. I'm sure someone's seen that one before. Or just something accidental or malicious. And this is really important because, as I've sort of put here, security controls can only go so far. There's going to be false negatives. Like, you get an email come in and it's from a Gmail address that's kind of just been set up, and there's no normal markers in there that a piece of tech can detect that it's a malicious email. Then you're relying on the recipient to go, oh my God, this is a malicious email. So people are the last line of defense. Oopsie, hang on. There we go. And then data management. So this is important. Do you know where your data is? Do you know what your data is? And this goes into things like classification. It goes into labeling. So when I say, do you know, so this, where is your data? And so where is, like, what systems is it on? What jurisdiction is it in? This is those types of questions. There's also, what is your data? Is it PII? Is it sensitive data? Is it public data? You don't really care. So this is where things like data classification come in. How is it used? There's lots of questions around that. In fact, there's other questions that probably aren't here, and we will talk a bit more about data strategy. As I said, this is a bit of a summary into what's coming, but things like, who is the owner? What are the retention periods? There's a lot of questions. And then, is it subject to any legal, regulatory, or contractual obligations? Is it subject to GDPR? Is it subject to the Privacy Act? have you basically signed into an agreement with somebody else to say you will notify them within 24 hours if a breach has happened? What are the requirements? And then how is it currently protected? Is it encrypted? Is it behind, is it in DLP? Does it have DLP controls? All those sorts of questions. So, how is it used? There's a lot of questions around data management. This is a big piece, but I think when we think about some of the breaches that have happened over the last, as I said, year, there are definitely some improvements that can be made in, just generally, I'm going to say, about data management. Like I said, retention is probably a big one. Between protection and retention, is it still needed? Obviously, there's minimum periods. So if you look at things like the Fair Work Act in Australia, there's like minimum periods where you need to retain records for, say, 7 years. Having said that, some regulations and legislation is a little bit more fluffy. The Privacy Act, for example, says that you should only keep it if you need it for a business purpose, but there's no specific time. That will likely change with privacy reforms, and there'll be minimum and maximum periods. But there is all those sort of considerations to consider. All right, and then we've got the monitoring and measuring piece. So there's two pieces here. There's, are you monitoring your environment? So that's the control around things like log management and visibility. So and then it's kind of a sort of a segue into the second point, which is your monitoring centralized and adequately protected? And I've seen many times where a data breach has happened or an incident has happened and logs weren't protected and the threat actors just deleted them. And so I guess the key thing here is it centralized? Is it protected? Are you using a SIEM or some other type of platform to securely collect, be able to correlate that data and analyze it for forensic purposes, but also trigger if something happens? If someone adds a privileged account, do you know that that's happened? And then there's the other part around, monitoring the effectiveness of both your security posture and your security tools. So I think, and I see, SOC and SIEM, that's kind of where this sits. And so we will, as I said, we'll talk in a bit more detail about this. So, what's a good way to help measure that effectiveness and to demonstrate that return on investment? Because, at the end of the day, you go through all this program building and defense strategy stuff and you implement it and it's all working, but someone's going to say, well, hey, did we spend the money right? Especially if you want to ask for more. So yeah, really important to do that. And then finally, because then we're going to go to questions again, the last piece is continual improvement. So, just when you think you're done, you're not. Big emphasis once again on ISO around continual improvement, but as I'm sure can all appreciate, the threat landscape is always, evolving and changing. And so you need to be across the that threat landscape, and you need to adapt and evolve. And as new things like AI come out, how are you addressing that? Is it administrative control? Is it a technical control? Is it a bit of both? Really, really important to do that. So it's not over once you're not done. You're never done. So I talk really fast, so I think I might have just pushed us ahead of schedule. I've got lots of time for questions now. In fact, we'll skip over this. I have a question slide.
Fantastic. And I am incredibly impressed. You actually have taken us to ahead of schedule. I was worried that we wouldn't get there, but we did. Unfortunately, right now, I have lost access to the Q&A as another IT Masters employee seems to have logged into the Zoom account from a different device. But I believe you have access to the Q&A, George. So I'm going to give you free rein there and answer any questions that you would like to.
Okay, then. So how would you compare the effectiveness of an organization aligned with NIST compared to the ISM? I don't know if there's a comparison, because I think at the end of the day, both of those rely on an appropriate risk management approach. And so I think it doesn't really, and it's recognized that it doesn't, these are tried and tested sort of or frameworks. And so as long as that risk is being effectively managed, that effectiveness is probably quite similar, because a lot of these aren't prescriptive. Having said that, I know that, the ISM, for example, I mean, and I'll lose count because it keeps changing. What is it, like 700 odd controls or something? Maybe it's 800, it's several hundred. It does go into some more detail. So, but it is also very big and kind of almost hard to digest. So with the ISM, for anyone that's not familiar, that's the Australian Government's Information Security Manual. And so if you are dealing with, and by the way, it is freely accessible. You don't have to be doing government work to use it. But one thing that I think is great, and sorry if you are on the receiving end, but if you're dealing with government data, you need to be compliant with it, and you need to potentially get IRAP assessed, which is the independent assessment program where someone comes in and basically attests that you've implemented this thing and you're dealing with risk properly. But it is very, very large and very potentially complex, and can be quite expensive to get compliant with it. So, if you're saying the ISM that's been IRAP assessed, then that is probably going to be potentially a little bit more effective. But if you're talking about just sort of like someone just goes and gets the ISM or NIST and they just do the risk assessments, they work out with controls, I mean, it depends how good of a job they do. So yeah, I don't know if that answered the question. I think it depends. It's probably a bit of a cop-out answer, but yeah, that's kind of where it's at. What is the best, quickest way to learn all or some of the frameworks to make sure we maximize our employability in the field? I was going to say there's a lot of them, and it depends. So, obviously ISO is pretty hot. Obviously there's criticism for it as well. It is not prescriptive. So it comes down to whether someone wants to, accept a risk potentially, and whether they're risk managing well. But, there's a pretty big demand. I find there's a lot of organizations right now that are going down the ISO front. Having said that, some don't want to spend the money. So, they go down the NIST route. So I find that NIST and ISO tend to be the two more common ones. And, you can download the NIST ones for free. The ISO ones, not so much. But there's plenty of good resources out there, like the ISO 27001 toolkit website will provide you with a little bit of insight into that. I think someone pointed at there's another organization that provides some free resources specifically on ISO. So yeah, but I think the good thing is to, go and have a look at them. And yeah, but from a market perspective, I find ISO and NIST, I know someone did mention the AC Essential 8 before, and we will talk about that. That is only 8 controls, very effective though for mitigating technical threats. And knowing how to implement even that is probably a good thing, because it is a very effective, I guess, set of guidance from the ACSC. So that's the Essential 8. Do you agree that policy management is the starting point of successful IT risk management program, especially aligning IT policy with operational risk? Yeah, I think that at a minimum, organizations should have an information security policy to kind of basically to mandate that you actually need to do something. So that is definitely a starting point. At a bare minimum, something like information security policy and acceptable use is probably a good starting point. There are some other policies that are obviously very useful, typically depending on what risks you're dealing with. So, you have those policies, and then you start building out your risk management stuff. So identifying risks, do you have BYOD? Do you use cloud? And then build policies around that. So yeah, I would definitely start with at least a couple of those high level kind of mandatory policies. What is the 18% remaining on the causes of these data breaches? I don't have the report in front of me, but I'm tipping it's probably something like, malware getting, exploited or something like that. I mean, it could even be physical. Oh, and a physical would be human element. But yeah, it's probably malware vulnerabilities, just your general run-of-the-mill sort of stuff. But yeah, take a look at the Verizon DBIR report. It's pretty thorough. I'm not really understanding the question about the private data. Was that my question about retention, or my comment about retention? So if it is that, it's more around retaining private information longer than you need to. So obviously there's going to be reasons why you need to keep it. For example, whether, so with Fair Work, there's a requirement to keep stuff for 7 years. For tax, there's probably a requirement to keep stuff for a certain amount of time. But keeping it well beyond the scope of when it is needed is an issue, and that's where retention periods come in. Human element equals end user as the weakest link. By this, I mean, do organizations need to monitor and ensure employee welfare, social? Do organizations to monitor and ensure welfare, social, emotional, financial in good order? I think that, so that's an interesting question, and I think that it's a bit of a tricky one. Depending, and my experience has been depending on what type of role that person plays. So for example, if they're in a role that has the ability to, and I'm kind of going to a bit of the, I'm gonna be careful when I answer this, but certain roles require certain different types of, kind of, I say monitoring, but at least sort of checks and balances, just from a risk management perspective. I'm not saying spy on people, like that's not a thing. I'm not saying that at all. I'm kind of thinking more, where I've been involved in roles, so I'm talking about me personally, where I've been involved in roles that are quite senior that may have access to, financial systems, and there's been different checks versus, when I've been in roles where I don't have access to things. So I think that's really around building out identifying the risk, and then once again, looking at what controls can be used to help treat that. So yeah, my view is always to take that risk-based approach, but obviously you need to consider those other factors as well in terms of, how is that going to affect, employees and things like that. So yeah, it's a bit of a tricky one. Definitely maybe involve HR in that one. Do you rate the ASD 8 or the AC Essential 8 now as a good starting point for all starting out in their cyber journeys? Yeah, look, I think from a technical perspective, and it is definitely a good step. It does the right things. When you think about how a lot of these sort of events have happened, it's malware, ransomware, business email compromise, vulnerable systems, macros, those sorts of things, right? And so the AC Essential 8, if you just kind of rattle these off the top of my head, deals with a lot of these things. So from a ransomware malware, application control, or app whitelisting previously, stops it from running. So yay. From a business email compromise, multi-factor, which is one of the controls, will will help prevent the successful login of phished credentials or disclosed credentials. Sorry, also on the ransomware piece, the daily backups will help with that. And then the various types of patching will help with those vulnerabilities. So, and I know I've missed one. Oh, the macros. So, malware downloads through macros, that's helped by only using trusted signed macros and things like that. So, yeah, absolutely. I think, and there used to be a stat on it. They got rid of it because maybe it wasn't quite right, but it was quite a significant portion of technical threats are mitigated through the use of the AC Essential 8. So yeah, definitely something that I've done. I've implemented it before to the point of app control, which was fun. But it was definitely something that did a really good job, especially for the effort. Can you explain the difference between cybersecurity and information security for the class? You're right. So these terms are used fairly interchangeably. I always took information security as more broad. Cybersecurity really focused on cyber and the internet. Information security is more, well, and feel free to anyone chime in if they have a different description, but information security covers everything. So for example, that will also cover like physical things. It's information as a whole. So it is a bit more broad than just cyber. So that's usually how I sort of take it. But yes, it's probably a good point to bring up because it's quite interchangeable in terms of how those terms are used. It was funny, it used to always be information security, and I feel like around 2013-ish, 2012, it just kind of changed and suddenly cyber was the new buzzword. So, but it is different, just. it overlaps. I think that's fair to say as well, right? So it's like cyber is almost it is kind of like a subset of information security. So information security being the more broad. Risk in employees working from home. Would you recommend an organization with multiple licensed users of a home work environment? What would you recommend on multiple of a home work environment? Look, a lot of these again are going to talk about risk. It depends what sort of information you're doing, depends on what your employees need to do. You know, sometime and also about the experience. So, you know, there are and how the infrastructure is configured. Like, are you using cloud technologies? Is it VPN? Like, this is very, very kind of hard to kind of answer without knowing more about the environment. There's obviously going to be risks of employees working from home, but you know, there's also going to be just risks day to day from people working, you know, even in a corporate environment. You know, we talk about this whole zero trust thing again. You know, back in the day, I remember it used to be like all this VDI stuff, right? You just remote in, you do everything remotely, and it was kind of hell because if the internet connection was crap, and it pretty much was back, you know, in the like 2000s, you know, you had like ADSL1, or, you know, if you were lucky to get a dial-up, but you know, all the information resided on the work network, but that wouldn't stop because your DLP was pretty average back then. That wouldn't stop someone just emailing something confidential out or browsing to Gmail on their work device and, you know, uploading or emailing stuff out that way. Nowadays, you've got technologies which we will talk about, like, you know, CASB, like DLP. As I said, there is that zero trust stuff as well. So yeah, there is absolutely risk, but the recommendations depend entirely on the situation. Will we cover CPS 234? Very high level, just from a kind of more, you know, obligations type perspective and what to consider when we're thinking about controls. But yeah, not too in depth. All right. Where are we? What else do we have?
Just while you're looking for another question there, George, Jax just had to jump out while we try and sort out her access. I'm just letting everyone know that we have closed the Q&A for the night, so we won't be accepting any more questions after we get through the ones that we are going to answer. And I'll give it back over to you now, George.
Okay, great. Which role person in a program typically drives strategy? This is going, once again, this depends on the organization. Like, I mean, it could be a CISO, so Chief Information Security Officer. You know, it could even be, and depending on the reporting line, you know, maybe they report to a CIO. That happens sometimes, and they may help drive strategy. It really depends, and I think there's been a lot of, over the years, you know, who is security meant to report to. So yeah, look, I think it depends on the organization, but generally you would say a CISO would do it. But yeah, they might, you know, an organization might not have one, so, or they may not be senior enough. So it's going to be the most senior stakeholder when it comes to information security or cybersecurity that will probably help drive the strategy, and then they'll delegate to whoever to help make that happen. So it depends. I know there's a bit of a depends thing going here. So hello, can you please delve deeper on gap analysis and asset inventory? So gap analysis is, I'm trying to work out how to answer this question. So I think it's going to be useful at some point, and we'll probably talk about this, like if you frame it with a standard in mind, that kind of helps. So let's say you look at something like ISO or NIST or whatever, and you look at your risks. So there's two things here. The first thing is, what are your risks? So you do your risk assessment, you work out what you need to do to treat those risks. So let's say you need to put in encryption somewhere, encryption of a database, or you need to put in multi-factor authentication. The gap assessment would then involve going and looking at your environment and working out what you do and don't have. That's basically what it is. So you're working out those gaps. So, and then once you've done that, that's your completed gap assessment, and then you know what you need to then go and do. And that would be prioritized based on where you're kind of most likely where your highest levels of risk are, and you would reduce those to an acceptable level. So that would be the gap assessment piece. In terms of, there was a question about assets, where'd it go? Asset inventory is around having almost a list of what your assets are. Assets can be anything that has some sort of business value. So that's another thing that's pretty hard to describe, but a system may be an asset, a database may be an asset, a repository may be an asset. There's all sorts of things. Even sometimes like teams or people can be assets, right? So, I'm sort of going down the business continuity front here, but if you think about if you've got an individual that's critical to the business and they're no longer available for whatever reason, I always say because they won the lotto, then they would be, how would you kind of deal with that? But yeah, from an asset can be anything that has sort of business value, and you should keep track of what that is. From a security perspective, let's say it's databases and files and repositories. Also then knowing what the kind of sensitivity and classification of those assets is very useful, because you would provide protections that are commensurate with those classification levels. So for example, if you've got a repository that's full of PII, so personally identifiable information, you know that because it's probably regulated and there's probably legislative requirements and there could be hefty penalties, that you need to put some focus and emphasis on that repository, and you would keep track of that in an asset register. If that makes sense. So you know that AI brings new, better ways to conduct defensive attacks. Do you think it will be as potent in defensive roles and monitoring and measurement? Yeah, look, I think so. I think, using yes and no. And the reason I say yes and no is I think at the moment there are, like, for example, ChatGPT, I think there's some limitations on, the age of the information. I think that it sort of cuts off. Is it still around September 2021? So, you could probably use it. I was thinking from like an open source intelligence or, some way to gather information, but it might be a little bit old. I think moving forward, as that sort of changes and, becomes a bit more real time, there's probably uses like that. So being able to, find out what's out there about, about your organization and use that intelligence potentially, I'm just speculating, I haven't tried this, to, help build, some better defenses and things like that. I think there's absolutely going to be uses for it. I think that once again, that's a watch this space. Yeah. I think we answered that ASD one.
I think that might actually bring us to approximately the end of our webinar.
Oh yeah.
Apologies if I'm a little bit out of step. We've had some slight technical difficulties on the back end. Thank you to Kit for jumping in and fixing everything up on that end. But just letting everybody know once again, because there is a real wealth of questions on this topic, that you can ask all of those questions and more. Direct those to the forums that you can find at learn.itmasters.edu.au. And I'm sure that many of those questions that people have as well might be answered in the next iteration of this short course, webinar number 2, which will be available to join next week, same time, same place. That is 7 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. So wherever you are in the world, look for Australian Eastern Standard Time, 7 p.m. next Thursday. And George will be filling us in on a whole lot more information. I know there's certainly a lot to process from this session as well. And thank you so much, George, for your fantastic skills and expertise in mentoring and your wealth of knowledge. Once again, if you're interested in doing a full-length course with itmasters.edu.au, IT Masters and CSU, you can head to itmasters.com.au and check out the options that might be available. Alternatively, you can check out your eligibility to study with ITM and CSU, a full-length course. And this short course will contribute to one of the 3 short courses. If you complete those 3, you can claim 1 subject worth of course credit for any of our graduate certificates or master's degrees for the, again, full-length courses. I believe that that should be it. If you had any technical difficulties with that, first of all, please do bear with us in terms of uploading the resources and the webinar recording. That should be done within 24 hours from now. But also you can email shortcourses@itmasters.edu.au if you've had any difficulty accessing this, or admin@itmasters.edu.au as well for questions about courses and how you can access the short course content. Is there anything that I have forgotten, George?
No, it was great. Thanks very much. Yeah, look, thanks everyone for jumping on, and guess I'll see you all next week.
Thanks very much, everybody. See you this time next Thursday. Have a good afternoon, good morning, good evening, or good night, depending on where you are in the world. Goodbye.